Well, we now come to the time of looking at character analysis. This is one of the first areas to examine in terms of understanding narrative genre. And when we think of the character analysis, the characters in a story, they're important because they help move the action of the story forward. They lead us towards the intended meaning of the author, that theological truth. It's going to be very difficult to understand the story if you don't understand who the characters are. So characters are not only do they provide clues for understanding the meaning of the stories through their actions, but they also do it through what they say in the form of their speeches or the dialogues. This is very true of the Gospels when you're reading a scene or a story where there's dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees. You learn so much, a lot from the dialogues that take place, from the conversations that take place. So I have a little chart here that if you want to understand the content of meaning, it's tied in with the actions of the characters and the speech of the characters. What they're doing and what they're saying is what you want to focus on. And so that's where you begin when you think about characters and the characters of the story and a character analysis. You know, when you think about a movie, when we have a movie, we have characters that are in a story and they have people who play those parts, the cast members. But here in the narratives, in the biblical literature, you have the different people who were involved in whatever that scene might be or that story might be. And so you want to be able to understand who the characters are. So the way you do this is you have to know what type of character is being portrayed in the narrative story. What type of character is being portrayed in the narrative story. You have different characters, but you got to find out what role are they playing. That's the idea. What role are they in regards to the story where they're in, that they're located in. So when you're reading a story, you need to identify the different characters, but you got to think in these categories that we're going to talk about. What are the main types of characters that appear in a narrative genre? So the main one is the protagonist. The protagonist. The protagonist, he's the main character. He establishes himself or herself as the lead role in performing the actions and the speaking. So this is the one who does most of the speaking. The story really revolves around that character and that character only. Everything else revolves around him. So you want to label him as the protagonist. Now, the protagonist doesn't have to be a good guy. The protagonist could actually be an evil guy. In terms of their biblical character, of what they're biblically portraying, either good or bad, that's not the issue here. The protagonist, you've got to think of the protagonist as the one who is dominant. The character who is dominant, the lead role. The story is primarily focused on that character. The actions and the speech, like I said, could be good or bad. But you've got to understand, you've got to label, you've got to identify who is the protagonist. Who is the protagonist? You think about it. I include some examples here. Abraham, from Genesis 12:1 to 25:8, he's the protagonist. He's the main one that dominates the story. Genesis 22 to Genesis 35 is Isaac. Then you have Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Joshua and Deborah in Judges chapter 4, verse 1. And Gideon and others like Ruth and David and so on. So you want to, when you see these stories, you want to ask yourself, okay, who is the main character? What character receives the dominant attention? What character does all the action revolve around? You got to identify that. That's your protagonist. Now, the next main type of character you want to examine and discover is the antagonist. The antagonist. This is the character in the story that opposes the protagonist. Now, you would normally think, okay, the protagonist has to be good and the antagonist person has to be evil. It would seem that way based on these titles. Pro is for, if it just implies someone who's good, antagonist someone who's evil, but again, good and bad do not come into play here. The way you think about this is the protagonist receives the dominant attention. The antagonist receives a good amount of attention, but the antagonist is in opposition to or set counter to the protagonist. And it may not be a good-bad situation. It just could be a dialogue that takes place. And so, you like, for example, Jesus calling Peter and Andrew to be disciples. They're the antagonists, but that doesn't mean they're evil people. Jesus is the protagonist. Or you could reverse it and say that they're the protagonist and Jesus is the antagonist. It just means that there's two characters that are set apart from each other so that they can portray the drama that takes place. So the actions and the speech of this character need to be understood. It could be a series of characters. You could have more than one antagonist. They need to be understood carefully by the reader to better discover the intensity of their opposition. Again, it could be that they're prejudiced or biased or, something bad. It could be that. It doesn't have to be that. It just means that they're set in counter, set opposite of who the protagonist is, whoever that person is. And so you want to be aware of that. You just want to be able to label who, in a sense, you want to say, who are the two main characters? One's got to be the protagonist, who's the most dominant. The antagonist is not as dominant, but dominant than everybody else. So you got two characters usually, and that could be collective. The protagonist could be a collective. The antagonist could be a collective. But who are the two main characters? And one receives the dominant attention, the other one just a little bit less, but they're in opposition to each other. And so you want to be aware of that. Now another category is what we call the foil. The foil. Again, these types of characters are taken from literature. And the foil, the character are characters. It could be more than just one. In the story, the foil, they contrast with the protagonist or the other characters, but you wouldn't label them as the antagonist. So they kind of set themselves, they are set in opposition to the protagonist, but they don't have the level of weight given to them as the antagonist would. Now, does it mean that the antagonist and the foil are together and they're in unison? Not necessarily. But again, this is a literary device. So the foil is set in contrast to the protagonist, but they have a minor role. They're not the leading cast member. They're not a dominant character in the story. So this character differs radically or is extremely similar, but with a key difference, setting him or her apart and the protagonist apart from each other. And why does the foil exist? Why do you have characters like this in a story? The purpose of this character is to highlight the qualities of the other characters. Again, your protagonist and antagonist are receiving they're receiving the dominant amount of attention. They're given that attention. They show up on more of the printed page than the foil. But what purpose does the foil serve? They add clarity to the protagonist and the antagonist. By them being in the story, it actually has an effect upon your protagonist and antagonist. They highlight the characteristics and the character of the protagonist and antagonist, no matter if that character is good or bad. That's the foil. So you could have more than one foil. You could have two or three. But you just want to be able to identify every character in the story and classify them according to what type of character they are. The final character you have to think about is the narrator himself. The narrator you can't forget about the narrator. And it's because the narrator is the one who develops the story. The narrator is the one who writes the story. And when you think about it from a narrator's perspective, you say, well, let's say Luke, for example. Luke writes 2 books, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And they're really 2 volumes of one continuous story. But when he was writing the Gospels, Luke is not in those stories. But he's quoting what Jesus is saying. He's quoting what the religious leaders are saying, or he's quoting what Jesus is saying as opposed to what the disciples are saying or some other character. And it's as though the narrator is omniscient, knows everything, right? Because he writes everything down. And he writes it with inerrancy, right? It's totally true. So the narrator, there's this element of omniscience exhibited by that character, but he's telling the story from his understanding of it. Yes, he's quoting the characters, but it's not just him writing about these characters. He's actually put them in action, giving them words to say. But with biblical text, these words are actually true. This is what was actually spoken. He's not making it up. He's not creating a fictitious tale. But when you think of the story from the perspective of the narrator, from, let's say, Luke, it's God that inspired his hand, right? That's moving his hand. So that every word is true, and every word's inerrant, and every word's inspired, but it's still coming from the heart and mind of Luke. So you got to think about the narrator. He develops the story. It's as though he's omniscient. He understands every aspect of the story. That's why he's able to write it. He tells the story from his point of view. And there may be a break in the action for this character to actually make a comment upon what has occurred or will occur. Sometimes the narrator may want to add something that's not in the dialogue, but he's explaining something. He's giving an emphasis to something, clarifying something. And so you have to be aware of that. That's the narrator speaking, if you want to think of it that way. There's a guy named Richard Pratt. He wrote a book called He Gave Us Stories. And in that book, he describes 4 types of ways in which the narrator can narrate. 4 types of narration. And it goes like this. There could be authorial narration. These are comments where the narrator directly addresses his audience by evaluating or explaining something in the story. So, there's the dialogue going on, but then the narrator, he's making direct comments to his audience by explaining something. He may be giving some background information. He may be telling some things that it's not coming from a direct quotation from one of the characters in the story. So that's authorial. Then you have description. This is when the narrator takes one step back from the center stage and stop the progress of the account to add descriptive details. The descriptive mode resembles authorial comments, but it's less explanatory. It just adds information that highlights some features of the narrative. It's like maybe a very short phrase, short sentence, but he's just adding some quick information, short information that's just quickly placed there to keep the story flowing along. So that's called description. And then you can have straight narration. Straight narration, this is when the narrator allows his reader to look more directly on the action taking place by connecting the readers to the drama that's occurring in the story. So this is when the narrator allows the characters to begin to really speak and really interact with each other. A dialogue. And so these are where the quotation marks begin to appear. So you have that aspect of narration as well. And then the final one is dramatic depiction. Dramatic depiction. This is when the narrator moves far into the background. Instead of reporting that something happened, he just permits his characters to speak, think, interact for themselves. This mode occurs most commonly in the Old Testament narratives through what we call indirect discourse. Genesis 50 is an example of that. Where it's like the narrator's not even visible. It's not even apparent. It's just back and forth. They're just talking to each other. So when you read a narrative account, you got to think about the narrator, and you may find all 4 types of narration in one story. And you want to be aware of that. You just want to be aware of the narrator. You want to think of the narrator who's actually pinning the story down as a character. And even like Luke, when you get to the book of Acts, Luke actually includes himself in the drama itself, in the story itself. It would be the same as a director, someone who directs a movie, but also acts in that movie. I think about some of the movies that have been in the Marvel Universe cinema, like Iron Man. The guy who directed those movies actually starred in them as well. And so that's a common thing they do in movies sometimes today. Sometimes the character in the story will actually be a part of the story itself. That will happen in the book of Acts at some places where Luke puts himself in the story because he was there with Paul on those travels. So when you think about the characters, you got the protagonist, the antagonist, the foil, and then you have this narrator. And the narrator is the biblical author. So Matthew for the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Luke again for the book of Acts, and all the narrators and the biblical authors for the Old Testament text. So that's how you want to think about the different types of characters that appear in stories. So what is the procedure for understanding the characters? How do you go about examining the characters in the story? Well, take a look at the procedure. There's three steps here. Step number one, you got to identify each character. So that could be names of people. Sometimes it just says the crowd. So it may not be an official name, but you want to label and identify each character. If you're just kind of doing it in your Bible, you can circle them, or something that would identify each character. Then after that, you have to categorize them. So all the different categories, the protagonist, antagonist, foil, those three types, every character fits one of those three types. Now, your protagonist is usually one person or a collective. The antagonist usually is probably one person or a collective of people. Sometimes there can be two antagonists. That can happen. So there probably could be two protagonists, but I've never really seen it that way. Either it's the collective, them together. So instead of as individual characters. So you got to label, you got to identify them, then categorize them according to those categories. Now, step 3 is where you spend most of your time, because you can quickly identify characters and you can begin to think about what category what type of character they are. But the next step, step 3, is you got to describe each character. Now that's where you got to really be in the text. As you read through the text and you're thinking about these characters, you got to be able to understand each one. And the best way to do this is write a series of statements that describe the actions and the speaking of the protagonist, antagonist, and foil. Since we're thinking of characters as what they say and what they do, right, equals the meaning. So you need to know what they're saying and what they're doing. You got to just examine each character. And so it may not be just in one part of the narrative story. You may see the protagonist, he's throughout. So what things is he saying or she saying, and what things are he or she doing? And you do that for all three groups. And if you got multiple foils, you do that for each foil. Now the foils they're not going to be as dominant. So there may not be as much to say or to write down. But you just write a series of statements. And next, after you do that, you note where the types of narration appear from the narrator. You also have to examine the narrator. So you have to think, okay, who's the narrator? Look at it from the narrator's perspective. And of the 4 different types of narration, where do those appear in the text? You want to note those and maybe explain those. So there's an example. There's an example in your textbook or in your manual regarding Mark chapter 3. It's also on the website. And I show you how to make that look on paper. So you want to be aware of the three steps. You identify them, you categorize them, and then you begin to describe them. You want to know as much as you can about those characters and what position they play in terms of their category, what type they are, how would you identify them, and how would you categorize them. So are they the protagonist, the antagonist, or the foil? That kind of information just by itself is not going to give you everything you need to be able to preach a sermon. But it's the first step in the process. You're going to gather a lot of data, a lot of knowledge in regards to what the characters are saying and doing and what position they play. Are they the most dominant, antagonist, or foil? How does the narrator look at this? You need that knowledge in your brain and in your heart. You need to have that because that's going to help you in determining, it's one piece of the puzzle that's going to help you in determining the what, the why, and the how. So that you will know the theological truth that's contained in the passage and all the expressions of how that theological truth needs to be explained. The key is connecting to the characters. That's where we start. Identify them, categorize them, and describe them, each one. And do that well. And the more descriptions you put down on paper, the more you can understand what's happening and what's going on. So that is character analysis. That's where we're beginning in terms of the process of exegesis for narrative passages.